Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 39th Annual PILC Conference, Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. We call it PILC here. It's hosted by Land, Air, Water. My name is Megan Sweeney, and I'm one of the conference co-directors this year, and I'll be serving as a moderator of this panel. This panel is called Sacred Obligation versus Settler Conservation, the Endangered Species Act as a Tool of Possession and Erasure. So I just want to give a brief tech warning. This is a Zoom webinar, so don't freak out if you're an attendee and you can't see yourself or hear yourself. That's just the way webinar is set up, where we can't see you, we can't hear you, so just sit back and relax. Throughout this panel, if you have any questions, at the end we'll have some time for a Q&A, so just click on that button at the bottom of the Zoom window that says Q&A, and don't be shy, just drop your question and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. Furthermore, I'll be putting a link in this Q&A. This link is to a Google Doc that outlines everything you need to know about getting CLE credits. So if there's any legal professionals in the audience who are looking to rack up some CLE credits, make sure you look at that document as it outlines everything you need to know about getting those credits through the bar. Also, that same document outlines how to donate to Friends of Land, Air, Water. Friends of Land, Air, Water is our alumni board. They help raise funds to provide stipends to students who are doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships over the summer. Any donations would be greatly appreciated. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have Kyle Keeler, who is a PhD candidate in environmental sciences, studies, and policy, and English literature at the University of Oregon. His work has appeared in forthcoming Early American Literature, ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, Edge Effects, and others. His current research focuses on settler colonial roots of the Earth's current geological epoch, the Kleptocene, and indigenous resistance to and resurgence in the face of settler-caused climatic violence. And then we have Paul Garcia, sorry if I mispronounced your name there, Paul. He's a postdoctoral scholar at the Humanities Institute at Pennsylvania State University, and he is an interdisciplinary scholar of Native and environmental studies. And with that, I will hand it over to our panelists.
So hi, everyone, and welcome. It's an honor to be presenting along so many other amazing friends and colleagues at PILC today on this gorgeous day. It's absolutely beautiful. My name is Paul Garcia, as Megan mentioned, and I'm a settler scholar, and I grew up in the Bay Area of California on Ohlone land. We'd like to begin today by acknowledging that the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya land, and I think it's important to remember that although we're meeting in a virtual space, that virtual space is not abstract or ethereal, it's on native land. The electricity running through many of our laptops comes from hydropower on the Columbia, for example, where dams such as the Dalles and Bonneville impede fish runs and flood sacred sites, such as Celilo Falls. So our discussion today develops a critical decolonizing perspective focused on the Endangered Species Act and its family of related policies. We argue that they undermine Native conservation sovereignty and healing practices based on kinship in various ways. While it's popular to think that environmental policies such as the ESA negate the most destructive tendencies of runaway capitalism, we argue that federal conservation policy has been crafted precisely to conserve colonial ecosystems insofar as they function to serve the social and economic needs of neoliberal capitalism and the continued ecocide of indigenous nations. But these strategies of accumulation do not march unchecked. Indigenous conservation based in practices of healing in relationship with land perpetuate resistance and resurgence, maintaining sacred relationships that extend back since time immemorial. So the Antiquities Act and acts of Congress designating national parks and monuments have received at least 2.5 decades of recent academic scrutiny, insofar as they operate as mechanisms for colonial land theft and dispossession, producing pleasuring grounds for settlers while juridically marking Native people as trespassers on their own land. The ESA and related policy have received less attention in this regard, despite the fact that they equally designate species and habitats as rightful possessions of the United States. The ESA states that species and habitats are worth conserving because of their aesthetic, quote, aesthetic, ecological, educational, historical, recreational, and scientific value to the nation and its people. This edict delimits federal, state, and NGO settler conservation models within a very rigid set of concepts and measurable values. What is missing are families or matrices of reciprocal moral relationships that make up ecosystem connectivity. The ESA provides an enduring social structure for the language of species to extract non-human kin from their relations and make them possessible scientific objects. The invisible status of native kinship relations as ecologically significant manifests as a logic of erasure within colonial conservation that takes aim at native practices of ecological healing and resurgence, which are in many cases rendered illegal. As Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powers-White has written, settler colonialism seeks, quote, the erasure of the systems of responsibilities constitutive of Indigenous ecological relationality. From an indigenized conservation perspective, it is not just species and habitats that become threatened and endangered. It is also the kinship relations of responsibility between human and other than human people that can become threatened and endangered. So our talk today will take shape through two central stories that chronicle the fraught histories of federal species conservation policy. The first story follows the life of Salish Sea, a southern resident killer whale who was captured in the Salish Sea as a juvenile and shipped to the Miami Sea Aquarium, where she is still held today. The Lummi Nation, to whom she is a direct relative, has entered a campaign to return her to her home waters and family, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, has consistently supported the sanctity of private property rights over kinship relations in its interpretation of the ESA. As Glenn Coulthard has argued, accumulation cannot function as a single historical event, such as capture, but necessitates ongoing practice of dispossession. The ESA provides just such a structure of accumulation by limiting conservation values to those recognized by settler science, and by extension, protecting the underlying material relations of capital and settler colonialism. The second major story follows the 30-meter telescope, or TMT, proposed to be atop Maunakea, and also the resistance of the Mauna protectors. We outline how the ESA extends its reach as a structure of land theft, fluidly moving from species to land itself. Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian spiritual and familial obligations to Maunakea, do not register within colonial conservation models because of baseline epistemic assumptions couched in white supremacy. Unsurprisingly, environmental litigation couched in the ESA has failed to persuade judges that the telescope would pose any new risks to endangered species and habitats. Nonetheless, Kanaka Maoli have fought against the threat of the telescope to the Mauna on their own terms, recognizing the ecological and relational significance of the Mauna for the wholeness of life in Hawaii. To build native sovereignty and create effective conservation efforts, the healing relationships based on kinship practiced by Indigenous peoples in North America need to be fundamental to conservation work. Our critique of the ESA does not call for it to be weakened. We suggest a twofold approach, seeking an indigenized framework for the ESA, as well as self-determined native conservation sovereignty. These are necessary steps for enhancing collaborative possibilities between Indigenous and settler conservation efforts. Despite its status as an effective policy in colonial conservation models, the ESA needs to be interrogated in terms of how it reproduces settler power, identity, and knowledge. Its basis in settler colonial logics of accumulation, commodification, and erasure and violence present a challenge to federal conservation policy, suggesting that it should be transformed to support Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination through native leadership and conservation, and an indigenized ESA that recognizes kinship as ecologically significant. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kyle.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Megan, and thanks everybody for being here. So I'm gonna share my screen real quick, and then we can get started. The violence of Native genocide, removal, and relocation for the purposes of land theft and assimilation are historically aligned with US policy absorbing species and habitats into schemes of Western environmental conservation and education. We're going to start with the discussion of Tokitai, as Paul mentioned, a killer whale born to the Salish Sea who was taken from her home as a juvenile in 1970 and was renamed Lolita by her captors before she was transported to the Miami Sea Aquarium in Florida to be put on display for profit. Her corporate owners use a public relations campaign that emphasizes her use for environmental education and awareness. However, the citizens of the Lummi Nation, located in the northern regions of the Salish Sea, see things differently. In the Salish language, the southern resident killer whales are called Quelholmachin, meaning our relations under the waves. The Lummi are not simply related to the whales in a generic manner. The whales are a relation in the sense that they are kin, specifically older siblings. In a recent naming ceremony, they rejected the name Lolita, which Douglas James Jr. has called a showgirl's name placed upon her by her slave masters. They renamed her Salish Sea, which means a female orca from an ancestral village site at Penn Cove. To detail this a bit more and allow former tribal chairman Jay Julius, who is among those most affected by this battle, and who's been so generous as to give Paul and I time so that we can understand in some way these issues, I'd like to give him a moment to speak on the matter in this short video before we go forward.
Stolen from her mother. She was stolen.
Has no volume.
Yeah, can you hear it now?
But here, in 1970, an event occurred that is unthinkable.
Can everybody hear it now? Okay, I'll restart it.
She belongs here. She belongs to the Salish Sea. Not to Miami, not to the owners of that seaquarium. She was stolen from the Salish Sea. She was stolen from her mother. She was stolen from her place of belonging. She was stolen from the place where the Creator placed her.
This is the Salish Sea in the Pacific Northwest, a region of North America renowned for its unspoiled beauty, pristine waters, and spectacular inhabitants. But here, in 1970, an event occurred that is unthinkable by today's standards. Over 40 orca children were captured during a period of several weeks, sold off like slaves, then transported to marine parks all over the world. This is Tokitai, the sole survivor of those captured whales. She has been living in this concrete tank for 47 years.
So, when NOAA first designated the southern resident killer whale an endangered distinct population segment, or DPS, in 2005, they juridically eliminated Lolita, or Tokitai, as a family member. The decision reads, quote, "The southern resident killer whale DPS does not include killer whales from J, K, or L pod placed in captivity prior to listing, nor does it include their captive-born progeny," unquote. This continuation of the separation imposed upon Salish Sea and the Lummi Nation is an explicit attack on kinship relations. As Jay Julius has written, quote, "Just like Tokitai, members of the Lummi Nation have endured centuries of destructive policies that separated our families, depleted our salmon runs, desecrated our sacred sites, and reduced our traditional fishing areas to a fraction of what they once were, unquote. NOAA removed this exclusion in 2015 upon consideration of a petition submitted by the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA. Even so, their rehearsal does nothing to return Scalichoctonaut to her home. NOAA says that, quote, the ESA does not prohibit possession of animals lawfully taken into captivity. Further, the ruling does nothing to recognize familial ties to the Lummi, referring only to, quote, Lolita's genetic heritage, unquote. This language mirrors the use of blood quantum in the determination of nativeness as a federal racial category. Related to Scalichoctonaut's captivity, the southern resident orca population is dwindling at an alarming rate. The current population count stands at 76 members, including Tokitai, which is close to the lowest population has been since researchers began keeping track. Most recently, another southern resident orca is assumed missing or dead as of January 28th of last year. While 2 calves were born in September of this year, and another, L125, was born on February 17th. NOAA's hypothesis for overall population decline, as of the last death, is a lack of Chinook salmon, which are the resident orca's main food source. Even though the problem is complicated, even the most cautious scientists agree that the increasingly poor condition of the whales, quote, may reflect nutritional stress, unquote. The Lummi Nation has responded to the crisis with ceremonial feedings and apologies to the southern resident orcas. In an interview, Raynell Morris, Senior Policy Advisor at the Sovereignty and Treaty Protection Office has said, quote, here at Lummi, when we see a relative starving, we don't go in and do medical tests to see how much they are starving. We know they are, and we do the right thing, and we feed them. Where NOAA is saying that they need to do more measurement, more science, we're saying that that's important down the road, but they're starving. You feed them now. On the other hand, NOAA views both the starving southern residents and Lolita as a species to be saved through conservation science and a member of that species to be studied. They've responded to the Lummi ceremonial feedings as unsustainable and something to, quote, be careful of, because according to University of Washington biologist Sam Wasser, you can't save these animals one at a time. That is despite the current excitement around resident orca L86, named Surprise, giving birth to a single calf in February. This stark contrast in philosophies regarding the orcas of the Salish Sea sets up a clear battle between the framework and methodologies of that U.S. conservation has come to rely on and the kinship ties that the Lummi Nation have based their lives on. Now, as Paul said, in investigating these differences, it's not our goal to call for an end to the ESA or set up a binary that cannot be crossed. Rather, what we want to do here is show how the ESA is and has been extractive and has operated in a colonial manner so that it does not do so now and in the future. That said, the interest of investigating this conservation battle in a robust manner, the ESA's colonial philosophies and practices must be studied in depth with a particular eye toward its tenets that species have to be protected for, as Paul has said, aesthetic, educational, historical, recreational, and scientific value to the nation and its people. And alongside that eye to the tenets of the ESA, I thought we'd all benefit from, taking a look at this picture of Richard Nixon next to a tree in a leather jacket, because that is at least a guy who wants you to think that he knows his way around a tree. At any rate, in terms of endangered species conservation in the United States, the ESA provides the framework for NOAA's interaction with the southern resident orcas and the group's conservation efforts as a whole. So if we take a look at NOAA's website here, we can see that they're responsible with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for implementing the ESA here. And as Paul discussed in our introduction, this leaves conservation organizations with a pretty stringent set of concepts for non-human animal preservation. These concepts being species and habitats. Once this happens, we lose all moral components of relationality. And while this viewpoint has seemingly worked for a non-human animal settler relationship, although that's debatable too, it continues to erase and devalue kinship ties that have been in place since time immemorial. As sociologist J.M. Bacon explains, settler conservation endeavors, quote, rely on Western science and law as their foundation for identifying and addressing environmental concerns. And in general, exhibit no explicit concern for social justice, nor any acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples as contemporary members of the world, unquote. In this way, the ESA's willful ignorance and erasure of kinship ties, seen specifically in the conflict between NOAA and the Lummi Nation, continues what Bacon has called colonial ecological violence, or quote, the ways settler colonialism disrupts Indigenous eco-social relations and generates specific risks and harms for Native peoples and communities. Taking a closer look at the specific methods for evaluating and placing value on endangered species through this lens, then, allows for a deeper understanding of both colonial ecological violence broadly and NOAA's current disregard for Lummi-Orca kinship specifically. In addition to placing Western science above Indigenous ways of knowing as a more robust empirical framework, which erases Native kinship ties, it is necessary to investigate the ESA's framing of species. To view a non-human entity as valuable only through the lenses of the aesthetic, ecological, educational, historical, and scientific value to the nation and its people, marks the non-human animals in question as creatures that possess no inherent value. They are worthy of existence only so far as they are beneficial to humanity, specifically in terms of the settler colonial nation state that is the United States of America. This framework functions equally to eliminate kinship ties and mark non-human animals as only valuable to settler ways of life. We're investigating the ESA here in a number of ways, but to try and provide a brief map, we first showed the ESA's framework to be extractive and possessive of endangered species, specifically in the species framework practiced by NOAA in the Miami Seaquarium. Then we explain how this extractive and possessive framework works hand in hand with colonial ecological violence to both erase Native kinship ties and further settlers as the anthropocentric normal. Because as Eve Tuck and Wei K. Yang explain, the settler views himself as more developed, more human, more deserving than other groups or species. In studying these settler conservation efforts as bound up in colonialism, we hope to show a stern contrast to Native kinship ties and healing practices, and in turn, call for a more robust and indigenized conservation framework moving forward. Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson describes settler colonial extractivism as, quote, stealing. It's taking something, whether it's a process, an object, a gift, or a person, out of the relationships that give it meaning, and placing it in a non-relational context for the purposes of accumulation, unquote. In terms of the United States conservation practices, extractivism for the purposes of aesthetics and recreational activities are bound up in settler histories of colonialism since the beginning of the concept of wilderness across the continent. According to historian Mark David Spence, removal of Native peoples across various national parks allowed early settler environmentalists wilderness retreats where they could best commune with and respect the natural world absent of human presence. In Glacier National Park, tourists and park managers believed that only citizens of an emerging world power could experience the mountains with appropriate awe and reverence. In this example, settlers would dispossess Native Blackfeet people in the name of racial superiority, arguing that settler ways of communing with the non-human natural were superior to those of the Native peoples who inhabited the area. Settlers stole land, removing it from relationships that gave and continue to give it meaning to the Blackfeet people. Regarding Lummi relations with southern resident orcas, the ESA and NOAA's strict adherence to Western scientific framework function in much the same way. These actions and policies act to colonially supersede Lummi methodologies and frameworks as the only appropriate way of interacting with and caring for the southern resident orcas. Viewing orcas as a whole in terms of their aesthetic and recreational value, as opposed to the relational framework and kinship ties that the Lummi have to orcas, reproduce the ethic of non-human natural as having value only as a backdrop. Orcas become an object for the settler gaze at the very best, and at the very worst, tools used to claim ownership and reproduce Euro-American superiority and colonialism. These settler endeavors to disregard Indigenous claims to land and discredit Indigenous ways of knowing other than human kin continues into the ESA's ecological value category. As many scholars have shown, in the United States, ecological value depends on race, gender, nationality, and ethnicity. That is, environmental injustices and access to safe and healthy living environments that reflect specific cultural values are highly contingent on race, class, and gender. U.S. conservation policy defines ecological value narrowly according to settler interests, regardless of the location, and frequently at the expense of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In this way, the ESA and NOAA's treatment of Lummi kinship ties to orcas only for settler benefit is a continuation of viewing other than human kin and their value only as they relate to the settler state and settler descended individuals. This ecological value is racialized in terms of conservation. The ESA and NOAA, though, is most clearly represented in the ESA's educational, scientific frameworks, especially when viewed through the Lummi's fight to return Lolita home from the Miami Seaquarium. So we can see this see if this will pop up. On the Seaquarium's website, where we see Ursinus orca, or the Latin name for killer whale, achieved popularity through conservation efforts in the 1970s and through its common home in marine life parks. The Seaquarium's use of Latin is rooted in the concept of species and can come to be seen as a celebration of orca captivity as a product of conservation efforts in the 1970s, evidence in the video shown earlier, which coincide with the conservationist fervor that created the ESA. These actions would serve to not only disrupt eco-social relations as a form of colonial ecological violence, but can also be seen as extractive in that they celebrate taking something, in this case Lolita, out of the relationships that give her meaning and placing her in a non-relational context for the purposes of accumulation. Seaquarium's use of Latin to mark orca populations as a whole works beyond naming Lolita's species. That is, it works to claim her in the same manner that settlers rename land itself in order to show not only superiority, but possession. Maori scholar Linda Smith has explained that by renaming land, settlers sought to separate Indigenous peoples from their homes and relations. Quote, newly named land became increasingly disconnected from the songs and chants used by Indigenous peoples to trace their histories, to bring forth spiritual elements, or to carry out the simplest of ceremonies. By renaming orcas, the Miami Seaquarium and their allies extract orcas from their traditional relationality with the Lummi. Because they operate within the framework of the ESA and species concept, these actions attempt to sever Indigenous relationships and instead place them in relationship within the language of Western Empire and settler science. In that vein, there is no mention on the website of Lolita's actual name, nor is there any discussion of reciprocity, kinship, or relationality between Lolita and the Lummi. Instead, the Seaquarium will charge $49.99 to view Lolita right here, thus refusing relationality in favor of monetary accumulation. But if you buy a ticket now, then you can go free for all year, or try to get that to disappear. There we go. You can spend $219 to ride a dolphin. Even further, on the Seaquarium's Reef Rangers page, which is dedicated to children who are passionate about environmental protection, science, and conservation, the Seaquarium fails to mention any Lummi relationship to the orca or the fact that Lolita was captured and taken from her home waters. However, the Seaquarium's page links to both the ESA's findings regarding the Lummi the southern resident pods, and NOAA's page on orca information, which includes a report highlighting the accomplishments of 10 years of dedicated research and conservation of the endangered southern resident killer whale population done by NOAA. But again, no discussion of Indigenous kinship ties to the whales. In this way, both the Seaquarium and NOAA work under the structure of the ESA to produce Western scientific knowledge through the reproduction of settler epistemological frameworks. These methodologies and findings are packaged as educational at the expense of the southern resident orcas and the Lummi, and the benefit of the United States scientific agencies and accumulative business practices such as the Miami Seaquarium. Such framing is indeed in line with the ESA's goals of situating such findings for the benefit of the nation and its people, as long as the nations in question are not the continental sovereigns that exist within the United States. Such reproduction of settler ways of knowing and interacting with other than human kin in the name of capital accumulation for the nation and its people is, according to Quandamuka scholar Eileen Morton Robinson, further, quote, underpinned by an excessive desire to invest in reproducing and reaffirming the state's ownership, control, and domination. The desire to own, control, and dominate is exemplified best in the Seaquarium's continued imprisonment of Lolita despite Lummi protests. However, those at the Seaquarium go even further than ignoring Lummi beliefs and practices in the name of conservation. And Seaquarium Curator Emeritus Robert Rose went so far as to attack and discredit the Lummi's purpose in bringing Lolita home and saving their relatives. In May of 2018, the Seaquarium posted this video of Rose on their Facebook page, which I'll show briefly, and I want to note is still on their Facebook page.
Hi, I'm Robert Rose, Curator Emeritus here at Miami Seaquarium, and I'm here with my longtime friend, Tokitai, or also known as Lolita. We're here today to hopefully change the story. We really want to change what we've been talking about for so many years here at Miami Seaquarium. Toki and I have actually been together for over 23 years now, and ever since I started here, we've been talking about her release. Well, it's really time to change the subject now and to talk more about the southern resident killer whale population. But before we do that, let me reiterate why we don't feel she's a candidate for release. Number one, she's lived here for over 47 years, a true testament to the love and care that we've provided her during that time. The second thing is just that, her age. She's over 50 years old now. She happens to be the oldest living killer whale under human care. The third, and maybe the most important thing, is the disease or pathogens. The possibility for her to be released and to obtain something that she's never been exposed to, or maybe even more importantly than that, to expose the southern resident killer whale to a disease that they have no way to fight. There's been a new call in the last couple of months by groups and an individual that are calling again for her release. Really, they should be ashamed of themselves. They don't care about Lolita. They don't care about her best interests. They don't really care whether she lives or dies. To them, she's nothing more than a vehicle by which they can promote their name, their political agenda, to obtain money, and to gain media attention. Shame on them. The Lummi Nation has even gone as far to say that she's better off dead. I mean, really? Better off dead? Shame on them. What we need to do is come together as a group to really help save the endangered southern resident killer whale population before it's too late. If we can come together with organizations like National Marine Fisheries and really find solutions to the problems that these whales face, the overfishing, the boat traffic, the pollution, then hopefully we can save this endangered group of animals. When I started with her over 20 years ago, there were over 100 southern resident killer whales. Today, those numbers are down into the low 70s. Together, working together, through her, with her as an ambassador for the conservation and education, we can hopefully find a solution and help recover this endangered species. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time. Hi, I'm
So, previous disregard for Lummi beliefs on the Seaquarium and NOAA's web pages and press release then are not because officials are unaware of Lummi practices, beliefs, or ventures regarding the southern resident orcas as a whole, and Tokitai specifically. Instead, as Bacon has argued, they are part of, quote, the pattern of discounting indigenous epistemologies and practices, which are visible everywhere in environmentalist discourse. Therefore, the continued imprisonment of a member of the Lummi family can come to be seen as part and parcel of the possessive nature of settler colonialism, made possible through discrediting indigenous epistemologies and efforts to save those family members. These actions fall in line with the settler conservation and scientific frameworks that the ESA, NOAA, and Miami Seaquarium have instituted and put into practice collectively. The ESA, NOAA, and the Miami Seaquarium then, through quite literally extracting knowledge from captive orcas by means of kidnapping and holding them hostage for settler observation, would capture Lummikin and put them on display, and then tout their own limited relationship to the orcas as both proof of their ecological understanding and their ownership of stolen land. In showing this control over possessed orcas and extracted knowledge, settlers claim scientific and territorial superiority and not only erase previous kinship ties, but continue such rhetoric into our contemporary moment. In so doing, they attempt to reproduce and reaffirm dominance on the continent. However, in reality, these settler efforts have contributed to orca starvation with no clear end in sight. And as Paul is going to discuss next, such settler endeavors are continued across oceans and onto literally land. Turn it over to Paul now.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. Just one moment here while I share my screen. So I want to start the second half here with a clip of Havane Rios, who is a Mauna protector and an artist and musician in Hawaii.
Beautiful to share time and space with all of you. O wauno o Havane Rios, o mauna aua kea ku'u mauna, o ko hako hau ku'u ka Hawaii, a o pu'u kapu ai mea no ho'i ku'u aina kulaiwi. My name is Havane. Maunakea is my mountain. Ko hako hau is my water, and pu'u kapu is the land that raised me. This chant that I just did, O hanau ka Maunakea, speaks of our genealogy. O wakea ke kane, o papavalinu ukavahine. Wakea, the infinite energy of the star realm, of the sky realm, is the father. Papavalinu, of the depths of the earth, is the mother. Born is Mauna a Wakea. Wakea, papahanau moku, the mother of these lands, give birth to Ho'ohoku Kalani, of the star realm. Born of Wakea, her father, Ho'ohoku Kalani, the daughter. Born comes Haloa. Haloa, the food of Hawaii. Haloa, the first Kanaka, the first person. So you see here that in our genealogy is the mountain. We are born of this mountain. The people of this land, the people that have the koko running through their veins, our veins. We are born with this responsibility. It is our birthright to protect our ancestors, those who came before, and those who will come after. This sharing is from my bowl. I was raised to know that we all have a bowl in us of wisdom and light and knowledge and water. So from my bowl to your bowl, ke aloha nui. From my heart to your heart, ke aloha nui. From my water to your water, ke aloha nui. I would like to take a moment, if everyone could just shut your eyes. Just shut your eyes and take a breath and breathe into this moment and be here with all of this energy in this room. Come and be here. And think of the place, picture the place, and become the place that raised you. What is the name of the wind that raised you? What is the name of the waters that raised you? What is the name of your mountain? What is the name of your land that raised you? Lift up those names, because those names are sacred. And just take a moment to breathe in.
So Havane Rios offers us a statement of Kanaka Maoli spiritual and national sovereignty in their relationship with Maunakea, the mountain of the sky god, which is the pico, the navel, and the center, both the beginning and the end, and a genealogical ancestor providing physical and spiritual sustenance. At the same time, Rios invites us to see the Mauna through the winds, waters, mountains that raised us, and to understand that Maunakea truly is the place where sky meets land and the birth of a lahui, a nation and a people. This worldview may come as a shock to those who are used to seeing the islands as the 50th state of the United States of America. As Kanaka Maoli author and leader Haunani K. Trask has said, statements of native sovereignty may stun most Americans who have come over the course of their consumer society, first world lifetimes, to believe that Hawaii is as American as hot dogs and CNN. It is from this place of knowledge, of knowing the Mauna as a literal ancestor, that the proposed 30-meter telescope appears as a continuation of colonial ecocide perpetrated on Kanaka Maoli at their birthplace. From a settler's perspective, however, the TMT does not initially appear to have much to do with ecological conservation, much less with the Endangered Species Act. But that's exactly what's at stake in this portion of the talk. How does the TMT register within colonial conservation models such that the Mauna itself is subjugated to settler entitlement and possession, while its existence as an ancestral relative is undermined? Scientists who stand to gain from the installation of the TMT have maintained an attitude towards Kanaka Maoli kinship as anachronistic, foreign, and even dangerous. As Brian Kuwanda writes, we are still considered nothing more than speed bumps, slowing everyone down on the road to progress. A now infamous email written by UC Santa Cruz astrophysicist Sandra Faber complained about, quote, a horde of native Hawaiians who are lying about the impact of the project on the mountain and who are threatening the safety of TMT personnel. Even her apology dichotomizes between, quote, ancient Hawaiian navigator traditions and the techniques of modern astronomy. Furthermore, as UC Berkeley astronomer Alex Filipenko excused himself after circulating Faber's remarks by claiming that, quote, the protesters represent the opinions of only a small minority. Kanaka Maoli's spiritual and familial obligations to Maunakea do not register within colonial conservation models because of a baseline epistemic assumption. As Haunani K. Trask wrote in From a Native Daughter, our culture is seen to be foreign, pre-scientific, and representative of the threatening because potentially uncontrollable unknown. Unsurprisingly, the environmental litigation couched in the eco-epistemic framework of the ESA has failed to persuade judges that the telescope would pose any new risks. In 2008, the Supreme Court of the state of Hawaii declared, quote, because the area affected by the 30-meter telescope project was previously subjected to substantial adverse impact, the Board of Land and Natural Resources finds that the proposed TMT project could not have a substantive adverse impact on the existing natural resources. The Mauna's previously degraded state was used as justification for further cycles of degradation and further breaches of sovereignty. However, as Rios reminds us, quote, saying no should have been enough. As a background assumption of this ruling, the ESA undermines and dishonors the spiritual knowledge of Native nations on their own lands by displacing their worldviews in favor of settler conservation models, positioning Kanaka Maoli as foreigners on their own land. Nonetheless, Kanaka Maoli have fought against the threat of the telescope, recognizing not only the ecological significance of the Mauna, but also its relational significance, for the wholeness of life in Hawaii. So where Kanaka Maoli relationality lies outside the ability of the state to profit or possess, it is rendered as invisible and attacked by colonial science. The rhetorical position of the astronomers and government officials who support the TMT functions by playing on a binary between scientific knowledge of researchers and the cultural beliefs of Kanaka Maoli. In its 2017 report on the contested case hearing for the TMT, Hawaii's State Board of Land and Natural Resources issued a relentless 345-page enumeration containing 1,070 findings of fact and 52 conclusions of law to back up the perspective. The introduction establishes the position of scientific fact relative to the ancestral knowledge of Kanaka Maoli by stating, quote, the belief that the Mauna is too sacred to allow large structures is a religious one. From this, we're to conclude that the Mauna protectors are basing their position on beliefs, while scientists are basing their position on facts and knowledge. This approach is wrong on two accounts. First, to call knowledge of one's ancestors a religious belief is wrong. The Mauna is a literal ancestor. Calling this a belief is like saying that someone has a belief that a particular person is their mother. If I introduce you to my mother, would your response be to say, well, that's an interesting religious belief you have there, Paul? Probably not. Ancestral and genealogical knowledge is knowledge, not belief. Second, this dichotomy covers over the real struggle that lies at the heart of the conflict, the struggle over land and sovereignty. Shifting focus to this struggle reveals an interesting state of affairs. The belief, not knowledge of astronomers and universities, in addition also the state, in their entitlement to land that is stolen. For example, in its 2018 decision, the Supreme Court of the state of Hawaii elides this basic fact in its statement by saying, quote, after statehood in 1968, the BLNR entered into a general lease with the University of Hawaii for the Maunakea Science Reserve. The court fails to mention not only resistance to statehood, but also the centuries of resistance to colonial rule that are carefully documented by Neonani Silva in her book, Aloha Betrayed. This includes the almost universal opposition of Kanaka Maoli to annexation in 1898, when they submitted a petition condemning the move to Congress with 21,269 signatures. One historian of the era referred to this resistance as the native menace. You might guess this is a white historian, echoing the attitude of many astronomers and state officials mentioned a moment ago. To put the TMT in its proper ecological context, then, it's necessary to look back on a long history of science and research as they functioned as tools of colonization and land theft in the Hawaiian Islands. Within this category of developments, the TMT is only the latest in a long lineage. The boom in military research during and after World War II brought the political fervor of the arms and space races. After Pearl Harbor in 1941, martial law was declared in Hawaii. Koho'olave, an island off the coast of Maui, traditionally used as a sacred training site for celestial navigation, was designated as a ground for naval munitions testing. When opposition to this use went mainstream in the late 1960s, the Navy used parallel arguments to those made by the Hawaiian Supreme Court to favor the TMT. The Navy claimed that the island was unrecoverable due to the sheer volume of unexploded ordnance. It was in the early 60s when Koho'olave was in the early 1960s while Koho'olave was still being bombed that Hawaiian peaks were targeted by state officials, NASA, and the US Air Force for observatory sites. Gerard Kuiper, an astronomer with the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory of the University of Arizona, was the first well-known astronomer to fixate on Maunakea as a site for an observatory. In a speech given atop Maunakea in 1964, to celebrate the governor's approval of a telescope project, Kuiper said, quote, I regard this discovery of Maunakea as a superior observatory site one of my main professional accomplishments. Kuiper's claims to discovery echo with far more than a desire for pure scientific inquiry. They are in perfect accord with the doctrine of discovery, which is used as a free pass for the theft of native lands. Additionally, Kuiper himself was a tool of the US Air Force and the Department of Defense, who had initially summoned him to assess Haleakala, a neighboring Hawaiian peak. Furthermore, it was recently disclosed that in 1958, Kuiper served as a planetary physicist for a classified mission called Project A119, which was initiated by the US Air Force. This project was intended to detonate a nuclear warhead on the moon as a surprise demonstration explosion and a show of force and scientific mastery. It is with this eye to expansion into the frontier of space and domination within that sphere that Kuiper approached Maunakea as an ecological possession in service of the United States, announcing that it would enable, quote, travel to the moon, hopefully by 1970, and later possibly Mars. The first major telescope to be built atop Maunakea was indeed a step in this process of militarization and expansion. In 1968, the University of Hawaii and the US Air Force built a 24-inch telescope that was the first of 13 to be constructed. Looking back to Kuiper's initial approach, it's clear that he saw the designation of the mountaintop as a science reserve to be of the utmost importance. He enthusiastically boasted the mountain to have, quote, the purest air that astronomers have found, stressing, quote, that recreation, conservation, and science are not rivals. On the contrary, their interests are parallel. Most major US observatories are on game preserves, in national forests, or in parks. He saw in Maunakea a pristine vantage point far away from the big city lights and industrial air pollution that could serve to further not only objective science, but also the political goals of the US, strengthening its, quote, scientific position by developing the potentialities of the mountaintop. In an essay delivered in Hilo at a neighborhood astronomers meeting in 1985, Kevin Crucianis outlined Kuiper's key role. Interestingly, Crucianis notes that many world-class observatories were established in the wake of major calamities, such as the Ulugh Beg Observatory created in the 15th century in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, after it was conquered by Tamerlane, who slaughtered an estimated 17 million people. He writes, Hawaii too is subjected to wave after wave of indefatigable invaders, but it is lucky for us that, I don't know who us is here, that these more recent hordes arrive in a more civilized state, brandishing such things as beach mats, cameras rather than swords and arrows. The us there being clearly others.
I just wanted to give you like a 2-minute warning. We have to end this panel at 11:55 to give time for the next panel.
I think I should wrap up here. Yeah. Sorry, I lost someplace. So David Miley writes, quote, the categories of science and time used to describe the TMT justify capitalist colonialist violence done to Mauna Awake. Indeed, the origins of the telescopes on the Mauna reveal that the TMT is about land, not science, and elucidates the ongoing settler colonial narrative of progress. Supposedly neutral scientific knowledge is inextricably bound up with colonial possession. As is delineated in the Maunakea Science Reserve Master Plan, the ecological significance of the mountain is managed in terms of species and habitats and the quality of access for researchers. In this way, it maximizes utility for settler science and degrades the relationship of Kanaka Maoli to the Mauna as a genealogical ancestor. So in conclusion, the ESA and its family of related conservation philosophies play an integral role in settler colonial logics of possession and elimination by transforming native lands and non-human relatives into corporate and state property. While contemporary settler conservation efforts are often focused on saving species from extinction in the name of biodiversity, they only become operational insofar as those same species are valued as national possessions. Meanwhile, native conservation, focusing on the maintenance of relationships with non-human kin, is either made invisible or rendered illegal. Indeed, settler colonialism takes aim at these relationships as a strategy of genocide, and it is the breakdown of these ecological ties that forms the basis for colonial ecocide, which includes the compromise of individual species and habitats. Therefore, the ESA must be indigenized to include kinship relations as a central conservation value, and native people and conservation must be decolonized for native nations. That's our talk. Thank you.
Panelists for taking time to chat with us today. We're going to have to end the panel here, but thank you all for your questions in the Q&A. I think we got most of them answered. We still have, I think, 5 more panels lined up for the rest of the day, so please be sure to check out our brochure. and attend the rest of our panels. Thanks, y'all, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.